Welcome to the second part of the look at the FRG between 1949 and 1963. The focus for today is going to be looking at the economy during this period, and the question we're going to be asking is, how did Germany move from being a country devastated, as we can see in this photograph in front of us, to being one of the powerhouses of Europe by 1963? What were the major problems then when the FRG came about in 1949? Well, first of all, they had limited sovereignty. The key problem there, of course, was the victorious allies in the West, the British, the French, and the Americans. They still had a fair amount of control over what the FRG did. This wasn't relinquished until the mid-1950s. Obviously, the West Germans also had to pay for the occupation cost, which, as you can see there, was 36% of the budget. Very high unemployment in 1950, 10% of the population. Almost 8 million displaced persons had to be integrated. Remember, these are the people who are coming in from not just the Soviet zone, but also parts of the former German Empire before 1914 and also before 1939. And so all these people were coming into the Western zones, and they need to be put somewhere. That obviously had a major knock-on effect of having the problem being housing. How are you going to house all these people and find them jobs? Major war destruction, especially in the key industrial areas, and also obviously reparation payments. $3.4 billion in the crisis of 1938. However, there were some pluses. The level of destruction wasn't as high, as I said to you before. The main problem was going to be in the industrial areas. Even then, it wasn't completely in terms of the factories and that type of thing. Often it would be the housing areas of where the workers were, rather than the factories themselves that were heavily bombed. You've also got American aid coming in through the Marshall Plan. Look at your notes from before to recap on that. It's also meant it was in the best interests of countries like the Netherlands, France, Denmark, Belgium, for Germany to be integrated and also pay its way in the world. Otherwise, they'd have to end up paying to prop it up. There was a skilled workforce. Obviously, a lot of it was missing due to either being captured or them being killed. But there were those people who had come back were still very skilled from working in the factories before the Second World War. You've got the successful currency reform in 1948 with the Deutschmark being introduced. You've got the conflict between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. We'll come back to the Korean War in a minute, later on. Long periods of economic growth right across the Western world. Places like France, Britain. Look at your notes from last year. Try and remember what it was like in Britain in the 1950s. It was unprecedented in terms of growth. Okay, not high amounts of growth consecutively, but at least it was ongoing. You've got the whole policy of the Marktwirtschaft, or the social market economy, led by Ludwig Erhard, who was the economics minister in the government. Trade unions wanted it to work. They weren't working against the government, they were working with them, partly because a lot of them were under social democratic leadership. There was no competition between, say, the KPD run unions and the SPD run unions, as had been the case in Weimar. And maybe the whole idea of creating a successful Germany would create a new identity for the West Germans. Remember, who were the Germans? They had to try and get away from this idea that they were warmongers, that somehow they'd started not just the Second World War, but the First World War. And so being seen as good, democratic Europeans in a successful economy, in a sense, put the idea of this other aspect of German identity on the back burner. Look at the growth rates there. Key dates there: 1951, 1955, and 1960. There were troughs as well as peaks, but those are very high growth rates. Per capita income. And we'll look at the next slide, which shows exactly what we mean by that. 1950, it was only 2,100 Deutschmark per person. By 1963, that had more than trebled to 6,700. And what I meant by this, if you look at this two photographs there, it's the same actor. On the top left, we can see Gerd Furber in a film in 1948, studied outside the Soviet War Memorial in Berlin. A lanky, tall actor there, obviously not had much to eat. Going on to the 1960s, very much put on a great deal of weight. In fact, if you want to know who Gert Furber was, he played Goldfinger in the James Bond movie of the same name. In many ways, this also encapsulates the idea that how many critics saw Germany within and without the country itself, as by the 1960s it could become fat, complacent and arrogant. So what was the Wirtschaftswunder, okay, or the economic miracle? This was the rapid economic growth after 1949. Well, why did it happen? Well, we've mentioned some of the factors before. First of all, Deutschmark, the introduction of a stable currency, the Deutschmark, which halted the inflation between 1945 and 1949. US investment of the Marshall Plan, we mentioned that. The large influx of refugees, we mentioned that before, but a lot of them were coming in to help in many different areas. Where those areas they didn't want to work in, often they managed to bring in workers from outside of what would have been the German Empire, from Italy, from Yugoslavia, and later on from Turkey. These became known as the guest workers or the Gastarbeiter. That did lead to other social problems as well. The German determination to pull together for national good, we talked about that. Few disputes between labour and capital. Germany had fewer burdens on the exchequer like the other powers. So, for example, Britain not only had empire but had commitments to other wars, such as Korea from 1950 onwards, and as did America. And so there were markets available for it to export its goods to. As you can see there, exports boomed. Tax laws were favourable to business owners, and there was heavy private investment, a large chunk of that coming from the Marshall Plan. As you see, unemployment fell from being very high, 10% in 1950, to 200,000 by 1961, which could be seen in economic terms quite negligible. GNP, gross national product, trebled. Annual growth averaging just under 8%. We looked at those figures before, but in terms of average, 8% is huge. If you compare to Britain, who was trundling along at 5% growth throughout that period, it's much better. Gap between rich and poor, though, did widen, but standard of living rose across the board. So everyone's getting richer, but the richer are getting richer faster, if you like. Okay. This again would stoke up problems later on. It booms in 1950. Industrial production, again, another set of figures here, going from 25% and 18% in 1951. Very high for most of the 1950s. This was an amazing economic recovery. Just bear in mind, from 1955, 10 years before, the country had been completely wrecked. It had been defeated and now was on the way to becoming an economic powerhouse. Second most important currency in the world after the US was the Deutschmark by the end of this period. Wages and salaries rising between 80% between 1949 and 1955. So as I said before, even though you've got the rise in the rich, everybody is getting better off, but not to the same extent. And as I said, this was going to lead to other major problems. One of the other major factors that was coming in there was the fact that West Germany was beginning to integrate itself into Europe. You got the beginnings of what became known as the European Union that we know today, but was known as the EEC, or the Economic European Community, from 1957 onwards. But the founding, before that, the founding agreements that started this whole the ball rolling was from the European Coal and Steel Community, created in 1951, and the European Economic Union, the Atomic Union, later on in the 50s as well. 1957, this was a key thing. West Germany's new central bank, the Bundesbank, was also created, a bit like the Bank of England. So who was in charge of the social market economy? Well, it was Ludwig Erhard, economics minister between 1949 and 1963, and then became chancellor between 63 and 66. One thing is if you often get the case there by a very successful senior minister often makes a very poor leader of a country. Look at what's happened with Gordon Brown. Often vice presidents are not good presidents in America. And we see this happening with when Erhard becomes Chancellor after 63, but more about that later. What does he do? Well, he lets the free market drive the economy with minimal state interference. Okay, the role of the state was to pick up the slack left by the market. So you have a safety net for those people who didn't succeed in the market, and therefore they would have access to benefits and things like that. Agreement the state should provide a safety net that all citizens could apply to. This was important. The equalisation of burdens law, which meant that it transferred wealth from the well-off to provide for those who'd lost everything during the war. So, for example, people who'd lost maybe factories or even just houses, money would be given from the rich to the poor to help minimise any hardships. Introduction of the 40-hour week. So even though you have the free market, but the workers could only work 40 hours, and this was an agreement between the unions and the state and the employers. This tripartite system worked and has continued to work right through from the beginnings of the FRG. Pensions increased and they were index linked, so they could keep pace with the cost of living from 1957 onwards. We'll look at the Nazi stuff a bit later on, but that should give you some idea of how the economy in the FRG continued to do very well from 1949 and 1963.